tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to talk about British Columbia here because every time I talk about the post-pandemic era or I talk about restrictions and mandates in the past tense, I always get a few emails, very kind, thoughtful emails from people in British Columbia saying, well, hate to break it to you, but it hasn't really ended here. And this is true. British Columbia, for a lot of the pandemic, was one of the best provinces for not locking down, for keeping businesses open. But not perfect. They still had the vaccine passport, and it has also been the most stubborn when it's come to the vaccine mandates, especially as they pertain to healthcare workers. So as we see now, BC is still holding to its vaccine mandate for healthcare workers, but they've said that no longer do you need to provide the proof of your vaccination status to your regulatory colleges. In fact, there's actually been a bit of a disconnect in how some people were reading this report originally and how it is now. And ultimately, I want to get to the bottom of this and talk about some of the legal challenges that are afoot against the British Columbia government over this. Joining me on the line now is Charlene Le Beau, who is a lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. And I should also just say, by way of disclosure, I actually sit on the board of the JCCF, though that had no bearing in setting up this interview. And I always put that disclosure just so everyone is aware of where I'm coming from in my support for the organization. But I'll ask you, Charlene, what is the situation in BC now, first and foremost? Because I think there was a bit of confusion this week about whether the government was dropping the mandate or just amending how it's unfolding.
Right. Thanks for having me, Andrew. Yes, the mandate is still in place for the BC healthcare workers. So any healthcare worker who is employed by a BC Health Authority is still required to show proof of having taken 2 doses of an approved COVID-19 vaccine in order to be able to work. So this new order that Dr. Bonnie Henry issued on July the 14th, just this past Friday, essentially cancels an order that she made on June 10th, 2022, about a year ago, that required regulated healthcare workers to provide proof of vaccination to their colleges. So really, that order impacted those in private practice, not those that were employed by a BC Health Authority. So that's very significant. So canceling that order means that those regulated healthcare workers in private practice do not have to show or do not have to provide proof of vaccination to their colleges. So it doesn't impact our lawsuit. So I'm one of the lawyers on a lawsuit in which we're representing 11 BC healthcare workers who were fired for not having taken the vaccine. So that lawsuit is continuing, and we have trial dates set for November of this year.
Now, how do they define vaccinated? Is it a 2-dose definition or a booster definition?
It's a 2-dose definition. There was some confusion in April of 2023. So April 6th, Dr. Bonnie Henry issued 2 new orders, and we call them the hospital and community care order and the residential care order. And there was some confusion because people thought that she was changing it to require or changing the definition of fully vaccinated to mean 3 doses. But in fact, that's not accurate. Those April 6, 2023 orders, they still only require 2 doses of the vaccine. The order talks a lot about the booster and encourages people to get the booster and talks about how good the booster is, but it doesn't require it. And those orders also essentially captured 2 new groups of workers, not even healthcare workers, but those workers that enter health facilities, such as construction workers and occasional workers who do not have contact with patients. So before the April 6 orders were granted, those 2 groups of workers if they did not show proof of vaccination, they had to physically distance and wear masks. So that was an exemption in those orders. It wasn't called an exemption, but it was that they were allowed to enter facilities without showing proof of vaccination. And now that's taken out of the orders. So now those two groups of workers are included.
Just to talk about the doses for a moment here, this is so absurd because even if you take the government's own messaging around vaccine efficacy at face value, which I think is fraught with challenges, but a healthcare worker who got their first dose in December of 2020 and maybe their second dose in, say, February of 2021 has gone 2.5 years without ever receiving any dose whatsoever of vaccine, which means the effectiveness of that vaccine, again, to use the government's own narrative, is zero. It is literally nothing. So the idea that is a requirement to work in healthcare is absurd when if you got vaccinated in January of 2021 or 2022 even, you are less protected than an unvaccinated person who got COVID a month ago is.
Yes, and that is one of our arguments for sure.
So what has the government done, if anything, in its submissions or in public comments to push back against this, to basically defend the science of its mandate?
Well, they're still repeating the same mantra, which is that the vaccine is safe and effective, and essentially they're silent on. I mean, I guess they say two things. They do acknowledge that the vaccine efficacy wears off over time, or wanes quickly, really. But at the same time, they say that it reduces symptoms and that having 2 doses is certainly better than being unvaccinated. But yes, you should get a booster as well. So those are the types of things that they say.
I saw, I can't remember the exact number, but I know that the BC Nurses Union just a couple of months ago was talking about the nursing shortages in BC. And the problem was the ratio of healthcare workers to patients was concerning and ultimately leading to a lack of adequate patient care. So here we have a government that is preventing people from working in its healthcare system. Well, the people in that system who are vaccinated, who've gone through the protocols, are saying, hey, we need more staff.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I mean, you'll hear Adrian Dix say, talk about how they're bringing in workers from overseas and they have a plan to increase the healthcare workers by, certain numbers. But yeah, I mean, the fact is that there is a serious healthcare shortage and they talk about how they're going to fix it, but it's still, a real problem.
What is the basis of the argument here? Because I know there's always been a bit of a question about the best avenue to challenge some of these mandates, whether it's on constitutional grounds or through other means. So what's if you can, as much as you can divulge anyway, what's the strategy that you're taking with your challenges?
Yes, well, part of the challenge is based on constitutional grounds, that it's a violation of constitutional rights. So that's one basis. But we're also looking at and challenging the science, so the efficacy of the vaccine, and also adverse reactions and things like that. So we're looking at the science, and we're definitely incorporating that into our argument.
One of the big things, and this has come up when we've talked about vaccine mandates in other sectors as well, whether it's the federal public service vaccine or the airline employee vaccine, and whatever the case is, that there are a few different categories of people here. There are those who say, you know what, I'm not going along with this, and therefore they lose their job or they get laid off or fired. They're victims of this. I would also say the people that get vaccinated against their will to keep their job are victims of this as well. And I don't know how you quantify that number, but there's a large group here of people that were literally coerced into this and are still being coerced into this because this is the only way they get to do what for many of them has been a lifelong calling, working in healthcare.
Yes. So yes, it does look like coercion. Absolutely. But the government's answer to that is it's a choice. It's still a choice. It's actually not a mandate is what they're saying. It's a choice. So, I mean, it really looks like a coercion. But technically it's still a choice. And the thing is that the right to work is not protected under the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. I'm assuming I know the answer to this, but I'm curious to hear the way you describe it here. How have the hospitals, how has the healthcare system been on exemptions? Because I know that technically, people can claim a religious exemption or a medical exemption to these things under human rights laws, but I know that these have been next to impossible for people to get reliably in other provinces when they've had these mandates in place.
Well, so the orders actually do not allow for any exemption other than a medical exemption.
They don't even allow the religious conscientious exemption. Wow.
No, that's right. And the medical exemption really is just the criteria is just such a narrow exemption that essentially nobody qualifies. So the exemptions require that you either have to have taken one dose. I mean, there's a whole list, but essentially you have to have taken a dose and been, had a severe allergic reaction, almost died, just gotten really ill from the first dose. And the exemptions really are not true exemptions. They're really just deferrals. So very few people have qualified.
Just to drill into that point, so someone could have a very good relationship with their family doctor, and the family doctor could be very pro-vaccine and say, in your case, I think you might have an issue with this vaccine because of X. And that person might actually have to go through that issue before that medical advice qualifies them for an exemption.
Well, yes, and first they have to go to an allergist to get that opinion. And the thing is many medical professionals were very reluctant to get involved in, to provide those kinds of letters requesting exemptions. So It's very difficult. Yeah, very difficult for people to obtain that exemption.
I don't have much time for the BC Human Rights Tribunal, but I know that it is a body that does have a fair bit of power on these things. So how has it not become involved in this when you have exemptions that, as I understand, should be protected under human rights law, at least, that aren't being respected by the mandate?
Yeah, I don't know of any cases at present that are being handled. Yeah.
Interesting. And again, I mean, the challenge with that body is that I feel it more often works against individual choice than for it. But from what you had just said, which I didn't know, that the BC mandates for healthcare workers don't even allow for the human rights exemptions that other provinces at least claim to. I found that quite shocking. So just looking forward here, I mean, we've seen in some of the COVID cases that have come up in different provinces, a fair bit of deference from courts to governments. And I'm wondering if you're expecting in BC to have a similar challenge afoot, or if maybe the courts in British Columbia have been somewhat better on this in your view.
I don't think so, no. The courts have been pretty consistent across Canada in deferring to the government and the government science. So Just a little bit more about our case. Many of our petitioners were administrative workers or who worked remotely anyway, not even due to the pandemic. And so one of our arguments is that the orders are overbroad because they are impacting, so these workers were fired for not taking the vaccine, and yet they worked in administrative positions so
they weren't at a risk of infecting a patient, which is basically the argument the government used to justify these things.
That's right.
Explain to me, if you can, and I mean, I know it's difficult to explain the inexplicable, but how the government has to back up here, what it seems like is that the government is trying to filter out a type of person that it doesn't want working for it, more than it's trying to prevent against any risk. And I'm wondering if I'm being perhaps too cynical there, or if that would align with your perspective on this, having now studied this file so extensively.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, they want a certain type of worker. Yeah.
So in this particular case, you have a mandate that really serves to just say, you're either on this side of the debate or you're on this side of the debate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate very much you chatting about this. I know we'll cover this up in November when the trial comes. Joining me now is a lawyer for the JCCF, Charlene Le Beau. Charlene, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.